The rain came down hard on Manhattan that Tuesday night, sheeting against the floor-to-ceiling glass facade of Vance Innovations' corporate tower like a punishment from the sky itself. Inside the vast marble lobby, the world was hermetically sealed, warm, gleaming, and utterly indifferent to the storm outside. Arthur Pendleton guided his industrial mop in slow, practiced arcs across the polished floor, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He was 35, with the kind of face that had once been described by financial journalists as weaponized calm, strong jaw, deep-set gray eyes that missed nothing, and a quality of stillness about him that most people found either comforting or unsettling, depending on what they had to hide. Tonight, he wore a faded Navy work uniform, 2 sizes too large, that he bought from a thrift store in Flatbush. His sneakers were worn through at the left toe. On the floor beside the supply cart, carefully arranged on a folded moving blanket, sat 6-year-old Leo. Leo Pendleton was small for his age, smaller than he should have been, if you were being honest. His face had the kind of pale, ethereal beauty that people sometimes mistook for delicacy, when really it was something closer to endurance. He was wrapped in a faded green scarf that had belonged to his mother, a hand-knitted thing that he refused to let Arthur wash too often because he said it still smelled like her. A children's paperback, The Velveteen Rabbit, lay open in his lap, though his eyes were drooping. He had a low fever. He'd had a low fever for 3 days. "Hey, bud," Arthur said softly, pausing his mopping to glance down. "You doing okay?" Leo looked up and gave him a smile that could have powered the whole building. I got to page 42. That's my guy." Arthur reached down and pressed the back of his hand briefly to Leo's forehead. Still warm. He'd given him the Tylenol at 6:30. The next dose wasn't for another 2 hours. He tucked the scarf more snugly around his son's neck and returned to work. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour. Nearly, but not quite. The elevator bank on the far side of the room glowed as its doors slid open, and the sharp click of heels preceded Eleanor Vance into the lobby like the opening notes of a storm warning. She was beautiful in the way that certain weapons are beautiful, precise, cold, and built to cause maximum damage. 32 years old, with dark auburn hair pulled back into a severe chignon, and a charcoal Armani suit that had probably cost more than Arthur's monthly rent. Her face was a masterwork of controlled expression, high cheekbones, full lips pressed into a bloodless line, and eyes the color of winter slate that swept the room like searchlights. Behind her trailed 2 senior board members, Harrington, the white-haired patriarch of the company's founding family, and Davis, the one who always voted against her in closed sessions. They were watching her. They were always watching her. 3 hours ago, she had walked out of a negotiation that should have been a triumph. The Meridian Partnership deal, 18 months of preparation, $40 million in advisory fees, her personal guarantee to the board, had collapsed in a single phone call. The other party had pulled out. No reason given. Just gone. She had held herself together in the boardroom. She had held herself together in the elevator. But now, striding through the lobby toward the parking structure, with Harrington and Davis murmuring behind her, she could feel the rage rising through her chest like floodwater. That was when she noticed the mop bucket. It sat precisely in the center of the path she needed to walk, a battered yellow thing, half full of gray water, positioned by the cleaning man who was working in focused silence several feet away. He hadn't heard the elevator open. Or if he hadn't thought to move it. "Hey." Her voice cracked through the lobby like a whip. Arthur looked up. Eleanor's eyes swept over him. The worn uniform, the too large jacket, the man who had placed his cleaning equipment directly in her path on what was already the worst night she'd had in months. "Move your things. Now." "My apologies," Arthur said, his voice quiet and even, already stepping toward the bucket. "I'll get it out of your. You've been standing here for the past hour," Eleanor said, and she was no longer keeping her voice low, because Harrington and Davis were right there, and they needed to see that she was in control, that she commanded every room she entered, every situation, every person. Mopping the same 6 square feet. "What exactly are you doing?" Arthur paused. He looked at her with those gray eyes, steady, unreadable. "I'm working, ma'am." Something about the steadiness of that gaze lit a fuse in Eleanor that she hadn't known was there. She stepped forward and kicked the mop bucket. It was a sharp, decisive motion, the kind a person makes when they want to demonstrate that an object, and by extension the person responsible for it, is beneath them. The bucket tipped, and gray, soapy water flooded across the floor in a wide arc, soaking through Arthur's worn sneakers and splashing up the legs of his uniform. The lobby went silent. Behind a supply cart, Leo looked up from his book. "This is what happens," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the entire space. "When people don't do their jobs properly. When standards slip. When people think they can coast." She looked at Harrington, then at Davis, then back at Arthur. "You're fired. Take your trash and your child out of my building." Not a single person in the lobby spoke. Arthur looked down at his soaked sneakers. Then he looked at his son, who was watching with wide, uncertain eyes from his little blanket on the floor. Arthur crossed to Leo in 3 quiet steps, crouched down, and pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "It's okay," he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. "Just a little water. Nothing to worry about." Leo coughed softly into his scarf. "Is the mean lady going to get in trouble?" "Don't call her that." Arthur smoothed his son's hair back. "We don't know what's happening in her life." He stood, lifted Leo carefully into his arms, and turned back to gather their few belongings: the blanket, the book, the small bag with Leo's medicine, and a thermos of soup. He did it without rushing, without a word of protest. The only thing he did, before walking toward the exit, was turn and look at Eleanor Vance one final time. She would think about that look for 3 sleepless nights. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was something far worse than either: a calm, crystalline assessment, as if he had taken the full measure of her in a single glance and found the result neither surprising nor particularly interesting. Like a chess grandmaster looking at a board arranged by a child. Then he turned, tucked Leo more securely against his chest, pushed open the heavy glass door, and walked out into the rain. The lobby remained silent for another full second after he left. Then Harrington cleared his throat. Davis was looking at his phone. Eleanor smoothed her jacket and walked toward the parking structure, her heels clicking with crisp authority. She didn't look at the gray water spreading slowly across the gleaming marble floor. The Brooklyn apartment was not large. Rent was $820 a month, a fact that Arthur's former colleagues on Wall Street would have found either hilarious or tragic had any of them known his address. The hallway smelled faintly of the neighbor's curry and the old radiator that knocked and hissed through the nights. The couch had a spring that had given up somewhere around year 3. The kitchen window looked out onto a fire escape and, beyond it, the back wall of a parking garage. It was, Arthur had decided 2 years ago, exactly what he needed. He settled Leo on the couch with a fresh pillow and the worn fleece blanket, and went to the kitchen to warm up the rest of the tomato soup. He moved efficiently in the small space, stirring, checking the temperature, portioning out the correct dosage of Leo's medication into the little plastic cup. "Dad," Leo called from the couch. "Yep. Do you think she has a dog?" Arthur brought the soup and the medicine, crouching beside the couch. "Who?" "The lady from the building." Leo accepted the medicine with the resigned stoicism of someone who had been taking it for as long as he could remember. "She looked like she might have a dog. A mean one. She didn't seem like a dog person," Arthur said. "Or maybe she needs one." Leo considered this. Dogs make people nicer. Arthur watched his son for a moment. The bright, curious eyes in the too pale face, the small hands wrapped around the soup mug. 6 years old, and already more generous in spirit than most people Arthur had met in 40 floors of corporate boardrooms. "Finish your soup," he said. "You need to sleep." He read 2 chapters of The Velveteen Rabbit until Leo's breathing went slow and even. Then he sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to the rain on the fire escape. Then he got up, went to the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. It was not a laptop that matched the apartment. It was matte black, custom-built, running encryption software that had cost 6 figures to develop, with processing power that could run simultaneous real-time modeling on half a dozen major market positions at once. It was the only expensive thing in the apartment, aside from Leo's medical equipment. Arthur's inbox contained, as it always did at this hour, approximately 40 messages. Most were from people he had worked with in his previous life, former colleagues, rival firms, private equity contacts who tracked his occasional, anonymous consulting work the way ornithologists track a rare species. They knew him only as AP, initials that, in certain financial circles, functioned less like a name and more like a myth. The architect, the phantom, the man who had engineered the infamous Halcyon reversal, the Meridian Group dismemberment, the quiet destruction of 3 hostile takeover attempts that the press had never fully understood. He had been, for 8 years, the most feared M&A strategist on Wall Street. He had walked away on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 2 years ago, when a pediatric specialist in a white coat had used the phrase chronic condition requiring consistent monitoring, and the world had simply rearranged itself around those words. He'd sold his Upper East Side penthouse, liquidated his firm, and moved to Brooklyn. He'd applied for a night janitor position because the hours were right, evenings and early mornings, when Leo was sleeping, and because the building had a quiet lobby where a small boy with a book and a blanket could rest undisturbed. He had never expected to be fired for it. He scrolled through his inbox without urgency. 3 requests for consultation on ongoing corporate disputes, 2 automated market alerts, 1 message, buried near the bottom, from a financial analyst he vaguely recognized. Vance Innovations. Due diligence, routine. He'd seen the ticker symbol in the news recently. Something about a strategic acquisition falling through. He filed it away and closed the laptop. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the rain-slicked bricks of the parking garage wall. He thought about a pair of winter-slate eyes that had looked at him like he was furniture. He thought about the sound of Leo's quiet cough and the way his son had, without hesitation, extended the most charitable possible interpretation to the woman who had just humiliated his father in front of an audience. Dogs make people nicer. Arthur drank his water. He went to bed. 12 blocks and 40 floors above the city's street level, Eleanor Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse apartment and stared at the rain. The apartment was spectacular, 2,000 square feet of minimalist precision, all glass and pale marble and carefully selected art. The view was the kind that made people catch their breath. She barely saw it anymore. She had poured herself a glass of wine and hadn't drunk it. It sat on the low coffee table behind her, growing warm. She kept seeing it. That look. She had fired hundreds of people in her career. She had made decisions that eliminated entire departments, cut loose individuals who were underperforming with the clean dispatch of a surgical instrument. She had never lost a minute of sleep over it. That was what decisive leadership looked like. That was what her father had taught her. But her father was dead, 3 months in the ground in a cemetery in Connecticut, and the company he had built over 40 years was now being circled by people who thought his daughter was a placeholder, a decorative heiress, a temporary measure until the real power could be installed. She picked up her wine, put it back down. The lobby, the mop bucket, the soaked sneakers, the boy with the green scarf, watching from the floor. She thought. He didn't even argue. That was the part she couldn't shake. Every other person she had dismissed, in every room she'd done it in, had argued, had protested, or begged, or at minimum displayed the proper degree of emotional disruption. It confirmed the hierarchy. It confirmed that the power in the room resided where it was supposed to. This man had looked at her like he was doing her a favor by leaving quietly. Eleanor pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. Outside, the rain fell without relenting. She went to bed at 2 a.m. and lay staring at the ceiling until 5. The call came at 6:47 on Friday morning, while Eleanor was on her second coffee and reviewing the overnight market data. Eleanor. It was James Whitfield, her CFO, an unflappable British man of 50 who had served the company for 20 years and who, in Eleanor's experience, was constitutionally incapable of calling before 8 unless something was on fire. You need to come in. Now. What happened? A pause. Marcus Thorne happened. She was in the office by 7:15. Marcus Thorne was 45 years old and had the kind of smile that made people check their wallets afterward. He ran a private equity firm called Thorne Capital that had, in the past decade, made a specialty of identifying companies in moments of vulnerability and engineering their acquisition with the precision of a bone saw. He wasn't a builder. He was a dissector, someone who took things apart to see what they were worth in pieces. He had, in the 72 hours since the Meridian deal collapsed, quietly acquired 17% of Vance Innovations' outstanding shares. He had done it through 6 different shell entities, moving fast enough that the regulatory reporting threshold hadn't triggered any alerts. By the time Eleanor's legal team had assembled the full picture on the conference room whiteboard, Thorne was already calling a press conference. "He's positioning for a hostile takeover," James said. His voice was controlled, but Eleanor could see the tension around his jaw. "He's going to go directly to the remaining shareholders. He's already put out the narrative: failing leadership, missed acquisition targets, declining investor confidence." Eleanor looked at the whiteboard. Stock down 11% in pre-market trading. 3 board members had already called James, not her, which was itself the message. "We have options," she said. "We have limited options," James said carefully. A conventional poison pill plays directly into his hand. It dilutes existing shareholders and actually strengthens his position for a proxy fight. He cleared his throat. "Eleanor, I need to say something I'd rather say in private." She looked at the assembled room. 6 people. She nodded, and they filed out. When the door closed, James set down his pen and looked at her with the directness of someone who had earned the right to it over 20 years. "This isn't a battle we can win with our current team. Thorne has been doing this for 2 decades. He knows every conventional defense in the playbook because he helped write the playbook. Then we find an unconventional defense." "Yes." James picked up a single sheet of paper and set it on the table between them. "There is one name that I keep coming back to. Someone who has beaten Thorne before, not once, but 3 times. Someone whose reversal strategies are so lateral, so entirely outside the standard frameworks, that Thorne literally cannot model against them because he can't predict the approach." Eleanor looked at the paper. At the top, in James's neat handwriting, "AP a myth," she said. "A person," James said, "who, according to 2 separate intelligence sources, is currently in New York." She stared at the initials. In the quiet of the conference room, with the city spread out 40 floors below and the pack tightening around her company, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since her father's funeral: a cold, clean thread of fear. "Find him," she said. It took Eleanor and her team the better part of 2 days to find an address. The trail was deliberately obscure. AP had not simply retired quietly. He had constructed his disappearance with the same meticulous precision he applied to everything else. No social media presence, no professional listings, no forwarding address from his former firm. What her team eventually found was a single thread: a private courier who had delivered a package to a specific address in Brooklyn 18 months ago, originating from a legal firm that had, 3 degrees of separation later, been involved in a transaction linked to a consulting entity using the initials AP. The address was on Vanderbilt Avenue in Prospect Heights. A 4-story walk-up with a green door and a buzzer panel listing 4 apartments by number, no names. Eleanor had her driver stop half a block away. She sat in the back of the car for a moment, looking at the building through the tinted window, the peeling paint on the door frame, the half-dead potted plant on the stoop, the fire escapes zigzagging up the brick face. A woman was coming out of the door with a small dog and a canvas grocery bag. This was not where Wall Street legends lived. She got out of the car. She was wearing a charcoal Armani blazer, different suit, same brand, same armor, with heels that were entirely wrong for the uneven sidewalk and a cask and portfolio under her arm containing the complete case documentation, financial models, and a blank check she had mentally prepared to fill out with a number that would make most people's hands shake. She pressed the buzzer for apartment 3B. Silence. Then static. "Who is it?" A man's voice. Low, controlled. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said. "I'm the CEO of Vance Innovations. I need to speak with you about a professional matter. I believe I have the right address." A longer silence. Then the door buzzed open. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, past the smell of someone's dinner, past the sound of a television in 2A, past a child's drawing taped to the wall outside 3A. A stick-figure man holding a stick-figure boy's hand under a yellow sun. She stopped in front of 3B and raised her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles connected. She had prepared for many things. She had modeled various scenarios during the car ride. An older man, perhaps. Gray-haired, imperious, the kind of person whose formidable reputation had preceded him into middle age. Someone who would assess her with the clinical detachment of a senior professional evaluating a pitch. She had not prepared for the man standing in the doorway in a faded gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and socked feet, holding a copy of Where the Wild Things Are Open in one hand. She had not prepared for those eyes. Gray. Still, with the particular quality of attention she had encountered only once before in her life, 3 days ago, in a marble lobby, looking up at her from over a mop handle. The world lurched. "You," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. Arthur Pendleton looked at her for a long moment. His expression gave nothing away. No surprise, no satisfaction, no anger. Just that same measured, complete attention. "Miss Vance," he said. She stopped. She looked at the book in his hand. She looked at the apartment behind him, the small, warm space with the reading lamp and the soup-stained couch and the child's drawings covering an entire section of the far wall. Her eyes moved back to his face, and something in her understanding of the last 72 hours, perhaps of the last several years, shifted fundamentally and irreversibly on its axis. "You're AP. Would you like to come in?" he said. "Or would you prefer to continue the conversation in the hallway?" She stepped inside. The apartment was smaller than her walk-in closet. Eleanor stood in the center of it with her portfolio under her arm and her heels on the scuffed hardwood floor, and she felt, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, like the least significant person in a room. She did not like the feeling. She had organized her entire existence around not feeling it. Arthur closed the door and set the book on the kitchen table. He did not offer her a seat. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at her with that unnerving, patient quiet and waited. She cleared her throat. She opened her portfolio. "I need your help. My company is under hostile takeover by Marcus Thorne. I understand you have experience with Thorne's methods. I'm prepared to compensate you at. I know what Thorne is doing," Arthur said. "Then you know it's urgent. I need someone who can—" "Why did you come to the door?" She paused. "I'm sorry. In the lobby," he said. "Why that door? Why that person?" He picked up a mug from the counter, drank from it without offering her any. "You needed to make a point. You needed Harrington and Davis to see you being decisive. And I was there." Silence. "That's not—" She stopped. She looked at the wall of children's drawings. At the small medication organizer on the counter, labeled Leo, Mon Tuesday, Wed Thursday, Friday, Sat, Son in Arthur's careful handwriting. At the worn green scarf folded neatly over the back of the couch. "You're right," she said. The words came out with some difficulty, like furniture being moved through a narrow doorway. "You're right. I used you. And your son was there, and I still, Dad." Leo appeared in the hallway that led to the bedroom, small and pale in dinosaur pajamas, his hair mussed from sleep, one hand rubbing his eye. He registered Eleanor's presence with the uncomplicated curiosity of a 6-year-old. Then his face broke into a smile of recognition. "Oh, it's the pretty angry lady from the building." "Leo," Arthur said. "Sorry, Dad. I know we don't say angry." Leo thought about this conscientiously. "The pretty stressed lady." He looked at Eleanor with large, earnest brown eyes. "You look like you have water on your face. Did you get rained on?" Eleanor touched her cheek and realized, with a small shock, that her mascara had tracked from the walk from the car. She had not cried. She didn't cry, but the cold had made her eyes water on the way up the block. Before she could speak, Leo padded to the kitchen counter, opened a drawer, and extracted a neatly folded paper napkin, the kind from a takeout bag. He crossed to her and held it up. She took it. She looked at this small, solemn boy offering her a paper napkin with the gravity of someone making a significant gift, and something inside Eleanor Vance's chest, something that had been calcified for a very long time, registered a hairline fracture. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was different than it had been 30 seconds ago. "You're welcome." Leo looked up at his father. "Is the pretty stressed lady going to help us?" "She came here asking for help," Arthur said. "Oh." Leo nodded. "Okay, that's a good thing to do. Asking for help is brave." He considered Eleanor again. "Would you like some soup?" "We have soup. Dad always says soup fixes things." "Leo," Arthur said quietly, "go finish your book. I'll call you for dinner in 20 minutes. "Okay." Leo started back down the hallway, then paused and looked over his shoulder at Eleanor. "I hope the soup works," he said, very seriously. And then he was gone. The apartment was quiet again. "I could take the case," Arthur said. "Thorne's position has some structural weaknesses. It's solvable." She exhaled. "Good. But not for you. Not the way you are right now." She looked up. "I beg your pardon. You came here because you need something, and I'm willing to consider providing it." He refilled his mug and set it down. "But you treated my son like a problem to be stepped over. and you treated me like I wasn't worth the air I was breathing, in a lobby full of people, in front of a child with a fever. He looked at her steadily. So here are my terms. Terms. Her chin lifted. Reflex, he noticed. The armor going back up. First, a genuine apology. Not a corporate non-apology. Not I'm sorry if you felt. A real one. He paused. Second, Leo has a medical appointment on Saturday morning. I need someone with him on Saturday afternoon while I do initial prep work on your case. You will be that person. She stared at him. You want me to babysit? I want you to spend an afternoon with my son, he said. Without your portfolio, without your phone, and without the suit. The silence stretched. Those are your terms, she said finally. Take them or leave them. Eleanor looked around the small apartment, the reading lamp, the careful medication labels, the paper napkin in her hand. She thought about Marcus Thorne's smile at the press conference, the comfortable confidence of a man who considered the outcome already settled. She thought about her father, who had built the company from nothing and who had, in his final months, squeezed her hand and said, "Don't let them have it, Ellie." "All right," she said. "Your terms." Something shifted in Arthur's face. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Saturday, 10 o'clock. He held out a piece of paper with the time written on it. And Miss Vance. She was already turning toward the door. "The apology is tonight," he said. "Now, while Leo can hear it." She turned back. He called Leo into the hallway, and the boy appeared again, looking between them with bright, curious eyes. Eleanor Vance, CEO of a billion-dollar corporation, a woman who had made senior directors of Fortune 500 companies flinch in her presence, crouched down to Leo's eye level, and in a voice that was quiet and unsteady and entirely her own, said, "I owe you and your father an apology. What I did in that lobby was wrong and unkind, and I'm sorry. You both deserved much better than that." Leo regarded her gravely for a moment. Then he said, "I forgive you. Dad says when people are mean, it's usually because something is hurting inside them." "Is something hurting inside you?" Eleanor opened her mouth. Closed it. "Yes," she said. "I think something is." Leo nodded, apparently satisfied. "Soup," he said firmly, and went back to his room. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Eleanor had spent Friday night reading every document James could send her on Marcus Thorne's acquisition history, not because she distrusted Arthur's competence, a quality she was rapidly recalibrating upward, but because sitting still with her thoughts had become impossible. She arrived at the Vanderbilt Avenue apartment at 5 minutes to 10, wearing jeans for the first time in what felt like years, a soft cashmere sweater, and flat boots. She had left the portfolio at home. She had, with considerable effort, left her phone in her bag on silent. Arthur opened the door, registered her outfit with a brief, neutral glance, and said, "Leo's had his morning medication. He's allowed half a cup of juice with lunch and 1 cookie if he eats everything on his plate. His doctor's appointment is at 10:30. I should be back by 4. Where does he? He knows where everything is." Arthur was already putting on his jacket, a dark charcoal blazer that, combined with a button-down shirt and pressed trousers, was a different register entirely from the work uniform she'd known him in. Even in this hallway, even in this apartment, the man occupied a space differently in that clothing. Something about the set of his shoulders, the precise economy of his movements. He can tell you what he needs. He's good at that. Arthur. She stopped him at the door. The use of his name, the first time she'd used it, made them both pause slightly. "I can do this." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said, and left. She stood in the apartment with Leo, who was sitting on the couch reading, and the quiet closed around her like something she had forgotten the texture of. "Do you know how to make grilled cheese?" Leo asked without looking up. "I know how to order it." Leo looked up. He considered this with serious eyes. "I can teach you," he said. "But first we have to go to my doctor. Dr. Reyes is nice. She has a fish tank." Dr. Reyes was, indeed, very nice. Warm office, large saltwater tank near the waiting area, the kind of manner that made small patients feel like collaborators rather than subjects. Leo introduced Eleanor as a friend of my dad's who's learning to make grilled cheese. The doctor examined Leo with a thoroughness and gentleness that Eleanor watched from the corner chair, and discussed adjustments to his management plan in language that was clear and compassionate. Leo listened attentively, asking 2 sensible questions, and then asked if he could say goodbye to the angelfish. On the walk back to the apartment, Leo insisted on walking, holding her hand with the natural ease of a child who has no particular suspicion of the world. Eleanor asked, "How long have you been seeing Dr. Reyes?" "Since I was 4, Leo said. She knows everything about my blood." "Does it scare you? Being sick?" Leo thought about it. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But Dad says the scary feeling is just your body trying to protect you. And he says as long as we know what's happening, we can make a plan. Dad makes really good plans." Eleanor looked down at this small, matter-of-fact person beside her. "Yes," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that." The grilled cheese was a disaster, then a near disaster. And then, after Leo patiently directed her through the correct butter-to-bread ratio and the critical importance of medium heat, something that was actually edible and possibly even good, Leo ate his entire plate and claimed his cookie with the dignity of someone who had fulfilled a contract. They spent the afternoon on the living room floor with a sprawling board game of Leo's own invention, which involved unclear rules, a significant amount of negotiation, and a dragon named Gerald who kept changing whose side he was on. Eleanor played with more concentration than she had brought to any board meeting in recent memory. "Dad lets me win sometimes," Leo confided, moving Gerald to her team without explanation. "I don't need you to let me win," Eleanor said. Leo looked at her. "I know. I can tell." He tilted his head. "You're really competitive. Is that bad?" "No. Dad's competitive too. He just hides it better." Leo moved Gerald back. "He says the best way to win is to make the other person think they're winning until they're not." Eleanor stared at the game board. "Leo," she said carefully, "does your dad ever talk to you about what he does? What he used to do?" Leo looked at her with eyes that were just slightly too knowing for 6. "He says he used to do numbers," he said. "Big number stuff. He says it's not as fun as it sounds." A pause. "He stopped because of me. Because I needed him to be around." He said this without drama, without fully registering the weight of what a child placing that kind of knowledge on himself was carrying. "I told him it was okay to go back sometimes. He said he didn't want to." Another pause. "He misses it a little, though. I can tell. His face does a thing when he's on his computer late at night." "What kind of thing?" she said softly. "Like when I'm reading a really good book," Leo said. "Like something's lighting up inside." She looked at the wall of drawings. She looked at the medication organizer. She looked at this apartment that was small and warm and entirely organized around the life of one small boy, at the cost of a life that had once occupied the highest floors of a very different world. The hairline fracture in Eleanor's chest spread another 1/4 inch. "Leo," she said, "I want to tell you something." She paused. "The night what I said to your dad. You were right there. And you were sick. And I still." She stopped. She was not going to cry on the floor of this apartment in front of a 6-year-old. She was absolutely not going to do that. That was wrong. Not just wrong. It was the worst kind of wrong. Dad said, Leo said carefully, that you were probably really scared about something. He said sometimes when people are in charge of big, important things, and they're afraid of losing them, they get mean. Not because they're bad people, because they're scared people. He tilted his head. "Are you a scared person?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I think I've been a scared person for a very long time." Leo reached over and patted her hand twice, with great solemnity. "Me too, sometimes," he said. "But it gets better, especially with grilled cheese." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, in a sound she barely recognized as her own voice. Leo grinned, apparently pleased with this result, and moved Gerald decisively to her side of the board. "You win," he announced. "I thought you didn't let people win." That wasn't letting. That was recognizing. He stood up importantly. "Do you want to read The Velveteen Rabbit? It makes you feel better when you're sad, but it also makes you cry a little, so we should get tissues first." Eleanor Vance, CEO, sat on the floor of a Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by a board game with fluid rules, and said yes. They read together until Arthur's key turned in the lock at 4:15, and Eleanor was 3 pages from the end and had, despite her best efforts, required 2 tissues. Arthur stopped in the doorway. He looked at the scene, his son tucked against Eleanor's side on the couch, the board game on the floor, the used tissues on the coffee table. He set down his bag. Leo looked up. "She cried at the real horse part," he reported. "It's a very sad scene," Arthur said. "That's what I told her." Leo beamed. "And I taught her grilled cheese. She burned the first one a little, but then she got it." Arthur looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him with a slightly defensive expression that, he suspected, was what she looked like when she was embarrassed and had decided not to show it. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, quiet and unembellished. But Eleanor had enough experience with language to understand that in this particular context, those 2 words were doing significant work. "Monday morning," she said. "You'll be there?" "I'll be there." She said goodbye to Leo, who hugged her around the knees with an unself-conscious force that nearly knocked her sideways, and took the stairs back down to the street. She sat in the back seat of her car without telling the driver to go anywhere for a full minute. Then she said home, and looked out the window at the buildings passing and tried to figure out why the penthouse, when she imagined arriving in it, felt, for the first time in years, like the wrong destination. Monday morning at Vance Innovations was not a morning anyone would choose to be present for if they had an alternative. Marcus Thorne and his team had arrived at 8:15, 4 attorneys, 2 senior analysts, and a personal assistant with a wheelie case full of documentation. They occupied the second-floor conference room with the comfortable possession of people who consider a lease agreement a formality to be dealt with after they've already moved in. Thorne himself sat at the head of the table with his jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, reviewing documents with a red pen and the settled confidence of a man conducting an autopsy on a patient who has already, in his estimation, stopped breathing. The board members who had signaled their dissatisfaction with Eleanor's leadership were clustered at one end of the room in quiet conference. Harrington, notably, kept his face entirely neutral, a neutrality that Eleanor, had she been present, would have recognized as his tell for significant personal ambivalence. She was not present. She was in her office on the 42nd floor, and James was with her, and both of them were watching the conference room camera feed on James's tablet. "He's going to call for the vote at 9, James said. "That gives us 53 minutes. "He'll have the votes," Eleanor said. "Probably." James looked at her. "Where is he?" She looked at her watch. "He'll be here." "You're certain?" "Yes." She set down the tablet. She stood at the window and looked at the city below. The morning light was coming in at a low winter angle, turning the tops of the buildings gold. "James, when my father built this company, who did he say was the most dangerous person in any negotiation?" James considered. "He said the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimated." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He did." The elevator bell chimed at 8:51. Arthur Pendleton walked out of the elevator on the 42nd floor at 8:52. He was wearing a suit. It was a charcoal Brioni, custom-fitted, cut with the precision of something that had been made for a specific body with the understanding that the body in question needed to move with complete authority and zero encumbrance. His shirt was white, his tie a deep burgundy, his shoes the kind of black Oxford that communicated, from the ground up, that every decision had been considered. His dark hair was set back from his face with the same minimal precision that characterized everything else about him. But it was not the suit, exactly. It was what the suit revealed. The quality of containment that Arthur carried in his work uniform, the held-back quality, the deliberately reduced presence, was gone. In its place was something that, once visible, made it impossible to understand how it had ever been invisible. He moved through the office like a current in still water, and every person his gaze fell on, even briefly, had the experience of being accurately and completely assessed in a single pass. He stopped at Eleanor's office door. She looked at him for a moment. She had an expression she couldn't quite control, something between recognition and something newer, something she hadn't had sufficient experience with to name yet. "You should have seen this coming," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not unkind, but entirely honest. "Your father saw Thorne as a peer. Thorne always saw your father as an obstacle. He's been building this position for 2 years. Can you stop it?" Arthur picked up the portfolio James had prepared and paged through it with the efficiency of someone who reads financial documents the way other people read menus. Quickly, completely, already planning the order. He stopped on a specific page. His jaw did something that, in a less contained person, would have been described as a smile. "Yes," he said. He closed the portfolio. "Let's go." The conference room on the second floor fell quiet when Arthur Pendleton walked through the door. Not because anyone knew who he was, not immediately. But there is a particular quality that certain people carry, an atmospheric shift that precedes explanation. That makes every person in a room recalibrate without knowing why. Two of Thorne's attorneys looked up from their documents and then looked at each other. Thorne himself, in mid-sentence, stopped. Arthur set the portfolio on the table. He looked at Thorne with the expression he had used in a great many negotiating rooms. The expression of a person who is not particularly interested in what the other party considers the situation to be. Arthur Pendleton, he said, I represent Vance Innovations leadership in a defensive capacity. I'll be handling the response to your position. I appreciate that you made the trip. Thorne stared at him. And then, slowly, the color shifted in his face in the way that it only does when a person recognizes, in a sudden and unwelcome flash, that they are standing on ground they thought was solid and has just proven otherwise. Pendleton, Thorne said, barely above a breath. Marcus, a nod, brief, courteous, implacable. You've had a long morning. Let's make this efficient. He opened the portfolio. What followed in that conference room over the next 2 hours was something that Eleanor would later describe, in a private conversation, as watching a chess grandmaster dismantle a system of traps that had been designed for an entirely different game. Arthur did not raise his voice. He rarely did. His voice was the same measured, even instrument it always was, but in this context, without the work uniform, without the careful self-erasure, the voice carried its full natural weight. And that weight was considerable. He began with Thorne's financing. The hostile takeover was funded through a network of 3 primary sources: a leverage position against Vance Innovations' own assets, a credit facility from a mid-tier investment bank, and a complex instrument involving short positions in 2 of the company's subsidiary partnerships. On paper, the structure was solid. On paper, it was the kind of architecture that had worked for Thorne 6 times in the past decade, and every conventional defense attorney in the room knew it. Arthur had spent Friday night and Saturday morning identifying the single fault line. Your credit facility, he said, setting down a document in front of Thorne's lead attorney, was established under a covenant that prohibits use of proceeds in any transaction where the target company can demonstrate premeditated market manipulation in the run-up to the triggering event. He paused. Your firm's short positions in Vance Innovations partnership assets predate your disclosed stake acquisition by 11 weeks. The timing is outside the safe harbor window by 19 days. Thorne's lead attorney looked at the document. Then he looked at Thorne. That's a creative reading, Thorne said. His voice was still steady, but Eleanor, watching from 3 chairs away, saw the muscle in his jaw flex. It's the correct reading, Arthur said pleasantly. And I have, as of this morning, filed a preliminary complaint with the SEC referencing this timeline. The complaint includes the digital trading records, obtained through appropriate legal channels, showing a pattern consistent with coordinated positioning. He picked up his coffee cup with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in this room, in this moment. Your credit facility is frozen, effective approximately 40 minutes ago, pending regulatory review. The silence in the room had texture now. That complaint, Thorne said carefully, will take months to resolve. It doesn't change. It doesn't have to resolve, Arthur said. It only has to exist. Your short positions in the subsidiary partnerships are margin dependent, and the moment your counterparties receive notice of an active SEC complaint naming you as a party, 2 of them exercise their contractual right to close the positions. He looked at Thorne directly. You're currently experiencing a liquidity event, Marcus. Not a catastrophic one, if you move quickly, but sufficient to make the financing for this acquisition untenable. The room was very quiet. Thorne's lead attorney leaned in and said something in a low voice. Thorne listened without moving his face. Arthur waited. What do you want? Thorne said finally. The question of a man who already knows the answer will cost him something. A complete withdrawal of your tender offer. A signed agreement to liquidate your current stake in Vance Innovations at market price over the next 30 days through approved channels, with no further accumulation. Arthur set down a single sheet of paper, and a donation of $5 million to the Children's Rare Blood Disorder Research Foundation at Weill Cornell Medicine. Personal check. Yours. Thorne looked at the paper. Then, for the first time in the meeting, he looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes and said nothing. The donation is not standard, Thorne's attorney said. No, Arthur agreed. It isn't. Another silence. Thorne picked up the paper. He read it. You could have asked for more, he said to Arthur. Something that might have been reluctant respect moved briefly across his face. You had me for more than this. Yes, Arthur said simply. I know. He had the signed agreement in 45 minutes. When Thorne and his team filed out of the conference room, efficiently, without drama, with the particular deflated quality of people who have just had an elaborate plan removed from them, the board members who remained looked at each other, and then at Eleanor, and the balance of power in the room had shifted so completely and so quietly that several of them were still trying to calculate when it had happened. Harrington caught Eleanor's eye. He gave a brief, single nod. She nodded back. In the hallway outside, Arthur was checking his phone. Eleanor came out of the conference room and stood beside him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The donation, she said finally. I know someone on the research team at Weill Cornell, he said. They're close to a trial phase for a treatment protocol that could be relevant for Leo's condition. Thorne's money will fund 2 years of the trial. She stared at him. You turned a hostile takeover into a research grant. The legal vulnerability was real, he said. The donation was a choice. You put his phone in his pocket. He would have fought the rest. He folded on that. Why? Arthur looked at her. Because some things are non-negotiable, he said. And the trick is knowing which things those are before you sit down. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about something Leo had said, about things lighting up inside. She understood now, watching Arthur in the corridor of the building where she'd fired him a week ago, what that lighting looked like from the outside. Thank you, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That complete, unadorned attention. But the temperature of it was different now. Something in it had opened. You held the company for your father, he said. That's why you were scared. Not for yourself. She said nothing. I know what that feels like, he said quietly. Holding something that belongs to someone you loved. The hallway was empty around them. 42 floors above Manhattan, in the quiet after a storm, Eleanor Vance looked at Arthur Pendleton and felt something she had categorically refused to feel for 3 years, the possibility of being known. She showed up at the Brooklyn apartment at 7 o'clock that evening with 2 canvas bags. Arthur opened the door. He looked at the bags. Leo is asleep, he said. I know. These are for Leo. She held up the first bag. Toys. Not age-inappropriate ones. I asked the pharmacist at the children's hospital what was suitable, and she helped me choose. She held up the second bag. Supplements and immune support nutrition, all cleared against his current medication list. I emailed Dr. Reyes this afternoon, and she approved everything. Arthur looked at the bags, then at her. You emailed Dr. Reyes, he said. She was very helpful. He stood aside and let her in. The apartment was quiet with the particular quality that small spaces have after a child has just gone to sleep. A warmth and residual gentle chaos. Books not quite put away. A cup with a straw on the coffee table, the reading lamp still on. Eleanor set the bags on the kitchen table and Arthur looked through them with a thoroughness that was professional and also clearly something more than professional. The practiced inventory of a parent who checks everything. He said nothing, but set the supplement bottles carefully in a row beside the existing medications. She sat on the couch and looked at the wall of Leo's drawings. She had looked at them on Saturday, but tonight she took the time to really see them. The yellow suns in the corners of every picture, the stick figures that recurred with consistent detail, a tall man with a small person, often with a third figure added in a different color, sometimes female, sometimes unspecified, always present. In one of the newer drawings, the third figure wore what appeared to be a small crown. Did he tell you he draws? Arthur said. He came and sat in the armchair across from her, setting down 2 mugs. Tea, which he had made without asking, which she accepted without comment. He showed me some of them on Saturday. He's been drawing the 3-figure pictures for about 6 months. Arthur looked at the wall. His voice was quiet, without performance. He started after he asked me, one night, if he'd ever have a mom. I told him I didn't know. He said that was okay, that he'd just draw one for now. Eleanor set down her mug. He drew one for now, she said softly. He's extraordinarily practical for 6, Arthur said. There was something in his voice that was pride and grief simultaneously, layered so naturally that she couldn't separate them. They sat in the quiet for a moment. When did you lose your wife? Eleanor said. 4 years ago. A pause. Her name was Claire. It was very fast, an aneurysm. Leo was 2. He doesn't have a lot of memories of her, which is the part that's hardest. He looked at his hands. He asked me to tell him stories about her, so he can build them. I've told him every story I know at least 40 times. A pause. He still asks. She was quiet. Your father, he said. How long ago? 3 months. She turned her mug in her hands. He was sick for 2 years, so it wasn't unexpected. But, she stopped. He ran the company for 40 years. He built it. Every decision I've made since I was 22 has been partly about proving to him that I was worth the trust. She looked at the tea. I was still trying to prove it when he died. And then he was gone, and there was no one to prove it to. And I was still doing the face. The armor. Because that's what you do when you're in charge. You don't get to fall apart. Says who? Arthur said. She looked up. Who made that rule, he said. Genuinely curious, not challenging. She thought about it for a long moment. My father, she said slowly. And also myself. I think I made that rule when I was about 12 years old and decided that being afraid was a form of weakness I couldn't afford. Arthur was quiet. What 12-year-old made that decision, he said. She looked at him. One whose mother had left, she said, and whose father had responded by working harder and saying less. And I decided that was the model. She paused. It's a very efficient model. It gets a lot done. Another pause. It's also, I'm realizing, quite lonely. The lamp made a warm circle of light in the small apartment. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds. A bus, a car horn, someone's music from 2 floors down, faint and unintelligible. I went to work every day for 8 years, Arthur said, telling myself that what I was doing, the deals, the structures, the money, mattered because it would eventually provide a different kind of life. The accumulation of options. He paused, and then I was sitting in a hospital room at 2 in the morning with Leo hooked up to monitors, and I thought, what did I miss today? What did he do today that I wasn't there for? He shook his head. The next morning I started making calls. Do you regret it? She said. Leaving. He thought about it honestly. Sometimes I miss the problem solving, the intellectual architecture of it. Leo said I light up when I'm at the computer late at night, and he's right. He looked at her. But I don't regret the choice. I'd make it again tomorrow. A pause. Today was different. Being back in that room. You were extraordinary, she said. Simply, without performance. It's a particular kind of problem, he said. I'm good at that kind of problem. You're the best at that kind of problem, she said. By a significant margin. He looked at her. There was something different in the look now. Less assessment, more presence. As if the careful distance he maintained as a structural habit was being, consciously or otherwise, reduced. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The donation. The Weill Cornell Foundation. She paused. Was that always part of the plan, or did you improvise? The legal vulnerability was the plan, he said. The donation, a pause. Leo's trial eligibility window is 18 months. The funding gap at Weill Cornell was delaying enrollment. I ran the numbers on Friday night. Thorne's Capital would close the gap with room to spare. He looked at the medication organizer on the counter. I have the leverage every time I sit across from someone like Marcus Thorne. I don't always use it for the obvious thing. Eleanor looked at this man, in his armchair, in his socked feet, in his small Brooklyn apartment, and felt something that was not yet named but was becoming difficult to avoid naming. Leo might get into the trial, she said. He might, Arthur said. There was that same layered quality in his voice. Hope and caution held in careful balance. The tone of someone who has learned not to let one outpace the other. He will, she said, with a conviction she hadn't planned. Arthur looked at her. I'll add it to the things I'm working on, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was, finally, definitively, a smile. They talked until midnight. It was not the kind of conversation that either of them typically had, not efficient, not directed toward an outcome. Just 2 people in a warm room after a long season of difficulty, saying the true things to each other in the particular atmosphere that is created when you have both, separately and together, run out of reasons to pretend. When Eleanor stood to leave, Arthur walked her to the door. She stopped on the threshold. The drawings, she said. The ones with 3 figures. What about them? The 3rd one, she said. In the newer ones, the one with the crown. Arthur looked at the wall of drawings from across the room. A small smile, private and deep, moved across his face. He said that one was a queen, he said. He said every dad needs a queen, and every kingdom needs one, too. She looked at him for a long moment. Good night, Arthur, she said. Good night, Eleanor. She walked down 3 flights of stairs and out into the cold night, and the city was loud and bright and entirely unremarkable, and she was smiling before she knew she was doing it. 6 months later, the cherry trees in Central Park were in full, extravagant bloom, the kind of May afternoon that Manhattan holds in reserve as evidence of its better nature, offered without reservation to anyone willing to look up. The light was warm and low and golden, and the grass on the sheep meadow was scattered with the comfortable disorder of a weekend afternoon. Families, dogs, cyclists, couples reading on blankets. On a plaid blanket near the eastern edge of the meadow, Leo Pendleton was deeply engaged in an argument with a large seagull that had taken a position approximately 4 feet away and was eyeing the remains of a baguette. "That's my bread," Leo said severely. "I need that for the ducks." The seagull was unmoved. "Leo," Eleanor said from her position on the blanket, not looking up from the document she was reviewing. Not a company filing, but a printed-out section of a trial protocol update from Weill Cornell Medical Center, which she had taken to reading the way other people read personal correspondence. "Don't negotiate with the seagull. They don't bargain in good faith. Dad says all parties can be negotiated with if you find the right leverage," Leo said. "Your father has strong opinions about things that apply in boardrooms. The seagull is its own territory." Arthur, who had been lying on his back with his arm behind his head and his eyes half closed, said without sitting up, "The seagull doesn't want the bread. It wants you to give up and leave. Don't give up. Just outlast it." Leo turned back to the seagull with renewed purpose. The seagull, seeming to sense a change in the psychological atmosphere, took 3 sideways steps and then lifted off with an air of strategic recalibration. "Huh," Leo said. "Outlasting," Arthur confirmed. Eleanor turned the page of the trial protocol. Enrollment had begun 3 weeks ago, and Leo's first treatment session was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Dr. Reyes had used words like encouraging trajectory and significant response indicators in the last 2 consultations, and Eleanor had taken careful notes on both occasions in a leather-bound journal she now kept specifically for Leo-related information, a fact she had not announced to anyone, but which Arthur had noticed and which had caused him to be very quiet for a moment the first time he'd seen it. The company was doing well. Better than well. The quarter following Thorne's failed takeover had produced the strongest earnings report in Vance Innovations' history, partly because of the market response to demonstrated stability, and partly because of 3 strategic advisory moves that Arthur had suggested in his informal consulting capacity, moves that Eleanor had implemented with her own characteristic decisiveness. The board had stopped murmuring about leadership instability. Davis had retired. Arthur was not on the board. He had declined, firmly and without elaboration, when Eleanor had suggested it. "I don't do boards," he'd said. "They involve too many meetings and not enough decisions." He consulted, when he chose to, on problems that interested him. He spent the rest of his time with Leo. He had been accepted into the Weill Cornell trial on the basis of research funded by Marcus Thorne's donated $5 million, a fact that Leo found extremely funny when he was old enough to understand the full story and Arthur retold it to him. "So the bad guy accidentally helped me," Leo had said, with the wide eyes of someone encountering a satisfying story structure. "More or less," Arthur said. "That's like a fairy tale," Leo said. "Eleanor, is that like a fairy tale?" "Somewhat," Eleanor said. "Do I get to be the prince?" "Obviously," Eleanor said. "You're the prince, your dad is the king, and Gerald is the dragon." "Gerald should be loyal to us," Leo had said, referring to the board game dragon with the same seriousness he gave all ongoing fictional relationships. "He's been going back and forth for too long." "Gerald has loyalty issues," Eleanor agreed. "We're working on it." On the blanket in Central Park, Arthur rolled onto his side and looked at Eleanor, who was still reading and had not noticed that Leo had identified a new bird to have principled disagreements with at the far end of the blanket. "You know that's the research protocol," he said. "Not a company document. I know what it is." She didn't look up. "You've read it 3 times. I want to understand the mechanism." She turned a page. "The cytokine pathway. I'm not clear on why the response window is specifically 72 hours. Is that an artifact of the treatment compound, or is it Eleanor?" She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had learned to read over the past 6 months, the expression that appeared when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. She had become, somewhat against her expectations, a person who knew Arthur Pendleton's expressions. "It's a good thing," he said simply. "What you're doing." She held his gaze. "I'm reading a document. You drove Leo to his checkup on Tuesday because I had a call that ran long," he said. "You made grilled cheese in this apartment 4 times last month, and you're getting better at it. You emailed Dr. Rhea's office to confirm the Tuesday appointment and put it in your calendar, and when I checked your calendar, which you gave me access to, I could see you'd block 2 hours after it in case the appointment runs long." She looked at him for a moment. "You checked my calendar. I have access." "That's not," she stopped. She looked at the protocol document. She thought about the fact that she had, earlier in the week, looked up 3 children's books that Leo hadn't read yet and ordered them, currently sitting in a bag in the back of her car because she wasn't sure of the correct moment to produce them. "Eleanor." His voice was quiet. "I've been thinking about something." She waited. He sat up and looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given her in the lobby all those months ago, complete and unshielded and entirely present. But what it contained now was different. What it contained now was the particular quality of certainty that comes from months of knowing someone in ordinary circumstances. Making coffee in the morning, navigating Leo's difficult medication days, having arguments about strategy that went on too long and resolved too late, falling asleep on the Brooklyn couch reading different books, and waking up to the sound of Leo asking if everyone wanted pancakes. "The Brooklyn apartment," he said. "It's going to be too small." She looked at him very carefully. "For what reason?" "Leo will need more space when he's older," Arthur said. "And for other reasons." "What other reasons?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind that develop over 6 months when 2 people are in each other's lives to the degree that we are. And the kind where a man decides he wants to stop being careful about saying what's true, because the alternative is wasting time he doesn't have any particular interest in wasting." The cherry trees moved in a slow wind. Leo, at the far end of the blanket, had befriended a pigeon. "Arthur," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, you're telling me," she said, "that the janitor I fired is now telling me he has feelings about the size of a potential shared living space." "The former janitor," he said. "And yes, that's what I'm telling you." She looked at him. She thought about the paper napkin Leo had given her in the hallway, the grilled cheese, the board game and Gerald's drifting loyalties, the reading lamp in the small warm apartment, the midnight conversation and the way he'd said says who when she told him she didn't get to fall apart, with genuine curiosity, as if the rule had simply never occurred to him. She thought about her father, who had wanted her to hold the company, and how holding things alone for too long makes your arms ache in ways you stop noticing after a while. "I have a townhouse in the West Village," she said. "3 bedrooms. Roof terrace. It has a very good kitchen. Leo would need the room with the best natural light," Arthur said. "Obviously. And we would need to discuss Gerald's canonical loyalties," he said. "Leo needs resolution on that plot line. Gerald is loyal to the king and the queen," Eleanor said. "Definitively. I've decided." Arthur looked at her. Something broke open in his expression, not the careful reserve, not the measured calm, but something underneath, genuine, full, and unhurried. The thing that had been building quietly in a Brooklyn apartment over months of grilled cheese and board games and midnight conversations, the thing that had no particular dramatic moment of arrival, the thing that was simply, suddenly, undeniably there. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Leo appeared between them with the energy of someone who has just had several productive conversations with park birds. He looked at his father. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the expressions on their faces with the particular, shameless perceptiveness of a child who has been paying attention to adults for 6 years. "Are you guys doing the thing?" he said. "What thing?" Arthur said. "The thing where you've decided something important, but you're acting like it's normal." Leo sat down cross-legged on the blanket with the air of someone settling in for a conclusion. "You both have the face." "We have been known to make faces," Eleanor conceded. "What did you decide?" Arthur and Eleanor looked at each other. "We're thinking about a new house," Arthur said, "with a bigger kitchen, and a room with good light." Leo processed this. "For me, for everyone," Eleanor said. Leo was quiet for a moment, with the considering expression he brought to important things. Then he looked at the remaining baguette. He looked at the park. He looked at his father and at Eleanor with the clear eyes of a child who has learned, through a year of paying close attention, what it looks like when adults are finally moving toward each other from across a distance they'd been keeping. He looked at the stick figures he'd drawn on so many pieces of paper: tall man, small boy, third figure in a different color, a yellow sun in every corner. "Is there a yard?" he said. "Roof terrace," Eleanor said. "Can I have plants?" "Any plants you want." He thought about this with great seriousness. "Okay," he said, "but I want the room with the most light. And Gerald has to be loyal to us from now on. I'm making that a rule." "It's a rule," Arthur confirmed. Leo nodded, satisfied. He tore off a piece of baguette and looked toward the area where the pigeon had last been seen. The afternoon light fell across the three of them, warm and unhurried, the way good things sometimes are when you've stopped running long enough to let them catch up. The cherry blossoms drifted in twos and threes across the blanket and the grass, and the city made its vast, indifferent music all around them. And in the middle of it all there was this: a man who had chosen his son over an empire, a woman who had finally laid down her armor, and a small boy with a piece of bread and a very specific opinion about plant placement and the absolute conviction that the world, which had sometimes treated him quite harshly, was on the whole a place worth being. Generous, too. The seagull came back. Leo squared his shoulders. "I outlast you," he said firmly. The seagull, in what could only be interpreted as narrative justice, left. And somewhere above the roofline of the buildings surrounding Central Park, in the long gold afternoon of a May that none of them had quite expected to arrive at, something settled quietly into place. Not with the dramatic finality of a deal being signed or a verdict being handed down, but with the quiet permanence of people deciding, without fanfare, that they are home.